Welcome to Lady Mythos. Everyone remembers Susanoo as the god who killed the dragon, the storm god, the serpent slayer, the wild figure with the shining sword pulled from a monster's tail. But almost no one remembers the part that comes before the legend. That long before he was anyone's hero, Susanoo was the reason the sun went out. Sit with that for a moment. The most famous storm god in all of Japanese myth does not begin his story as a savior. He begins it as the villain. He ruins a sacred hall. He causes a death in heaven itself. He weeps so hard that whole seas run dry and green mountains wither to bare stone. And in the end, his own family, the shining gods of heaven, do the one thing you never expect gods to do to one of their own. They throw him out. So here is the question I want you to carry with you tonight, all the way to the last minute of this story. How does the villain become the hero? Is Susanoo a monster who was somehow redeemed? Or is he a force that the neat, ordered world simply never knew what to do with? Hold on to that question. We are going to answer it, but not until the very end. We will follow him from the strange moment of his birth to the day he becomes the lord of the land of the dead. And I promise you, it gets darker and stranger than the tidy little dragon story you may have heard in passing. If this is your kind of tale, take a second to subscribe, because it truly does keep these stories coming. And I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, so leave it in the comments. Now, let us go back to the very beginning, to cold river water at the broken edge of the world. One last thing before we start. As we go, you are going to notice that the old books do not always agree with each other. They argue about who won a certain contest. They argue about who killed a certain goddess. They even whisper, in the quietest corners, about where this god truly came from. I am not going to paper over those cracks and hand you one clean story, because the cracks are where the real Susanoo lives. So when we reach them, I will show you both sides and let you decide for yourself. Keep that in mind. It matters more than you would think. Chapter 1. Born from a god's grief. The birth of Susanoo. To understand Susanoo, you have to start with his father, and with the worst day his father ever had. The creator god Kusanagi had gone down into Yomi, the shadowed land of the dead, to bring back his wife. Her name was Izanami, and he loved her, and she had died bringing fire into the world. He went into the dark to find her, and what he found there was not the woman he remembered. He fled. He ran up out of the underworld with the dead at his heels, and he sealed the entrance behind him with an enormous boulder, shutting his wife on the other side of it forever. When he finally stopped running, he was filthy with the pollution of that place, the cold, clinging residue of death itself. And so he went down to the mouth of a clear river to wash it away. What happened next is one of those quiet, enormous moments that myths do so well. As Kusanagi bathed, gods began to be born from him. Not carried, not laboured over, simply born out of the act of washing away grief. When he cleansed his left eye, out came a goddess of pure light. This was Amaterasu, who would rule the high heavens as the sun. When he cleansed his right eye, out came Tsukuyomi, the cold, quiet god of the moon and the night. And then Izanagi washed his nose, and from his nose came the third child. A god who arrived not as light, not as calm, but as weather, as wind and salt, and the low pressure that comes before a storm. This was Susanoo. Remember that detail, because it tells you something. His brother and sister came from the eyes, the parts of us that take in the world. Susanoo came from the breath, from the part of us that rages and sobs and cannot be kept quiet. Izanagi looked at these three radiant children, and he was, for the first time in a long time, glad. So he divided up creation between them. To Amaterasu, he gave the plane of high heaven, the realm of the sun. To Tsukuyomi, he gave the realm of the night. And to Susanoo, his youngest, he gave the sea. The wide, rolling, endless sea. It should have been a gift, a whole ocean to call his own. And for two of the three, it worked out just as their father hoped. Amaterasu rose into the sky and became the light we still turn our faces toward. Tsukuyomi took the night, and apart from one dark episode we will come to later, mostly kept to himself, quiet and pale and distant. Two children who fit their gifts perfectly. And then there was the third, the one from the breath, the one who took his ocean and did not sail it, did not calm it, did not rule it. From the very first day, Susanoo was the one who did not fit the shape that had been cut for him. Now, here is a small knot that storytellers have argued over for centuries, and I will not smooth it away, because the contradictions are half the fun. He is given the sea, and yet almost everything he ever does is about the storm, the wind, the thunder, the weeping rain. Some tellings call him a god of the ocean, others a god of tempests. The truth is, he is both, and neither is quite big enough to hold him. Because Susanoo did not take his ocean and rule it. He did not do anything with it at all. He simply stood at the edge of the world his father had given him, and he began to cry. And he did not stop. Which brings us to the first real mystery of his life. Why would a god who has just been handed an entire ocean refuse to even look at it, and instead weep like a lost and heartbroken child? Chapter 2. The God who wouldn't stop weeping. His weeping was not gentle. Understand that first. When Susanoo cried, it was not a private, quiet thing. It was a catastrophe. The old records say that as he wept, the green and growing mountains withered until they were dry and dead. The rivers shrank, the seas themselves dried up. His grief was so vast that the living world began to die around him, simply because he could not be comforted. Imagine standing near that. A grown god, powerful enough to command the tides, sitting at the shore and sobbing. until the landscape itself cracks and browns and fails. The other gods must have found it unbearable, and his father Izanagi certainly did. He came to his son, and he asked him the obvious question, the question any parent asks. Why? Why are you doing this? Why will you not simply rule the beautiful sea I gave you and be at peace? And Susanoo's answer is the key that unlocks his entire character. He said he was weeping because he wanted to go to his mother. He wanted to go to the land where his mother had gone. He wanted to descend into that same cold underworld, Yomi, the place of the dead, and be with Izanami. Think about what that means. Susanoo was born from Izanagi alone, from the act of washing off death. He never knew his mother. She was already gone, sealed behind that boulder before he ever drew breath. And yet he aches for her. He longs for a woman he never met, in a place no living thing should ever want to go. That is the wound at the center of this god. Not anger, grief, a homesickness for somewhere he has never been. There is even an old uncertainty buried in his very name. Nobody is completely sure what Susanoo means. Some scholars trace it to an old word for acting wildly, for being impetuous and violent. Others link it to a word that means to advance, to press forward. A name that hangs somewhere between raging and pushing on. I find that fitting for a god who is one long argument between despair and defiance. But Izanagi did not hear the grief. He heard defiance. Here was his son, refusing the gift of an entire ocean, wailing that he would rather go down to the dead. And Izanagi, who had only just barely escaped that place himself, was furious. In his anger, he made a decision he could not take back. He banished his own child. "Get out," he said. "If you will not rule what I have given you, then you will not stay here at all." And Susanoo accepted it. He did not fight it. But before he went down into exile, he decided there was one person he had to see. One goodbye he had to say. His elder sister, up in the high plane of heaven, the bright one, Amaterasu. So he turned and began to climb, up toward the realm of the sun. And here is the thing about a storm god climbing a mountain. He does not climb quietly. As Susanoo rose toward heaven, the whole world began to shake. The mountains trembled, the rivers churned, the seas roared. From up above, it did not look like a brother coming to say farewell. It looked like an army. It looked like an invasion. And his sister, watching him come, reached for her weapons. Chapter 3. Amaterasu versus Susanoo, the contest in heaven. Picture Amaterasu at the boundary of heaven, watching the horizon buckle. She is the sun. She is order and light, and the calm center of the divine world. And something is coming up toward her that makes the mountains dance. She does not think, "That must be my little brother, come to be sweet." She thinks, "He has come to take my kingdom." So she prepared for war. The old story lingers on this image, and it is a striking one. The sun goddess bound up her hair like a warrior. She slung a great quiver on her back, bristling with arrows. She braced her feet, and she stood her ground at the edge of heaven. And she called out to the storm rolling toward her. "What are you doing here? Why have you come?" And Susanoo, to his credit, told the truth. "I have no evil in my heart," he said. "I am only here to say goodbye before I am cast out." But Amaterasu had ruled long enough to know that a raging god at your gate is rarely there for a hug. She did not believe him. So Susanoo offered her a way to prove it. A trial. A contest of creation. "Let us each make new gods," he said, "from the other's belongings. And the children we produce will show you the truth of what is in me." So they made a wager of life itself. Amaterasu reached out and took the long sword that hung at her brother's side. She broke it into pieces, and she crunched those pieces in her mouth. And she breathed out a bright mist. And from that mist, 3 goddesses were born. 3 shining daughters, out of the storm god's blade. Then it was Susanoo's turn. He took the string of curved jewels, the magatama beads, that his sister wore twined in her hair and around her arms. He took them into his own mouth, and he breathed out his own cloud of mist. And from it came 5 gods, 5 sons, born from the sun goddess's jewels. Now, watch closely, because here is one of those forks in the story where the old books themselves disagree. And I want you to hear both sides. Susanoo looked at the result, and he declared that he had won. "My heart is proven pure," he said, "because I have produced gentle female deities." Or in another reading, because the male gods came out on his breath, and males were the sign of a true and honest heart. Either way, in his own eyes, he had triumphed. But there is another version, and in it, the victory is not so simple. In that telling, the children belong to whoever owned the object they came from. The 3 goddesses came from his sword, so they are his. The 5 gods came from her jewels, so they are hers. By that logic, it is Amaterasu who comes out ahead, and Susanoo's claim of victory is just noise. Which version is true? The books will not agree, and I will not force them to. But keep it in mind, because it changes everything about what happens next. It changes whether the storm that is coming is the fury of a winner, or the tantrum of a god who has been told, once again, that he does not measure up. Because whatever the true score was, something in Susanoo broke open in that moment. He had come to say goodbye. He had passed his own test, and instead of peace, he felt that old familiar thing rising in him again, the thing that dried up the seas. And this time, he did not weep. This time, he raged. Chapter 4: The Crimes That Broke Heaven. What Susanoo did next is the part the tidy versions of his legend quietly leave out. The hero on the shrine posters, the noble dragon slayer, does not sit comfortably beside what actually happens in these next few scenes, so let us not look away from it, because you cannot understand his redemption unless you understand exactly how far down he fell first. It began with the fields. Up in heaven, Amaterasu kept sacred rice paddies, the neat and holy fields that fed the divine order. Susanoo went through them like a flood. He tore down the ridges that held the water, he filled in the channels, he trampled the careful work of the gods into ruined mud. It was the act of a god saying, "Your order means nothing to me." Then it got worse. When his sister held her sacred harvest festival, the solemn feast of first fruits, Susanoo defiled the holy hall itself. He fouled the sacred place where the gods gathered to give thanks. Amaterasu, remarkably, kept making excuses for him. "That is just my brother," she said. "He is drunk. He does not mean it." She kept finding reasons to forgive. And I think there is something painfully human in that. In a sister who keeps insisting the person she loves is better than his worst behavior. And I want to pause on that patience, because I think it is one of the most human things in the whole myth. Amaterasu was the most powerful being in heaven. She could have ended her brother with a word. And instead, she kept shrinking herself, kept making herself smaller, kept telling the other gods that he did not mean it, that he was only unwell, that he would be better tomorrow. Anyone who has ever loved someone who kept hurting them knows exactly what that feels like. The excuses you make. The line you keep telling yourself he will not cross. And then he crosses it. But there was one thing she could not explain away. In heaven, there was a hall where the divine women sat and wove the bright cloth of the gods. And it was a place of calm and rhythm and quiet skill. The soft clack of the looms, the threads pulled tight. Susanoo took one of the sacred, dappled horses of heaven, and he did something to it so cruel that I will spare you the details. Then he tore open the roof of that peaceful hall, and he hurled the ruined creature down into the middle of it. The women at their looms scattered in terror. And in the chaos, one of the heavenly weaving maidens was struck, and she did not survive. Let that land. This is no longer mischief. This is no longer a moody god knocking over the furniture. A death has entered heaven, and Susanoo brought it. The storm has finally done something that cannot be excused, cannot be laughed off, cannot be forgiven with a sister's tired smile. And Amaterasu, the sun, the endlessly patient one, finally reached her limit. She did not shout. She did not strike back. She did something far more frightening. She turned away from all of it, from her brother and her ruined heaven and the death he had caused, and she walked toward a cave in the rock. A great cavern in the mountainside of heaven, and she reached out for the heavy stone door. Chapter 5. The Day the Sun Went Out. She stepped into the cave, and she pulled the great stone door shut behind her. And the sun went out. Not dimmed, not clouded, gone. Amaterasu was the light of the world, and she had just sealed herself away in the dark, and so the world she left behind fell into a darkness that was total and absolute. Try to feel the scale of it. Every field, every ocean, every mountain, every home of gods and the first living things, all of it plunged at once into a night with no moon and no dawn coming. The records say that the cries of 1,000 troubles arose all at once, like the buzzing of flies in the dark. Evil things stirred in the blackness. The whole of creation held its breath, because the sun had abandoned it. And one god had caused this. One tantrum. One storm that would not be governed. The other gods, 800 of them, gathered in that endless night, desperate. They schemed. They gathered outside the cave, and they set a bronze mirror where the light would strike it. They hung jewels on a sacred tree, and then one goddess climbed onto an upturned tub and began to dance. A wild, comic, stamping dance, until the gods watching burst out into a roar of helpless laughter that shook the darkness. And I want you to sit with the strangeness of that plan for a moment, because it tells you something about how these old stories understood the world. The way you coax the light back is not with force, not with threats hammered against the stone, not with armies, not with pleading. It is with a mirror and a joke, and the sound of people laughing together in the dark. Curiosity and joy, not fear, are what draw the sun back out. Remember that. It is exactly the opposite of everything Susanoo had been doing. Inside the cave, Amaterasu heard it. Laughter. Joy. In a world that should have been mourning her absence. She could not stand not knowing. She cracked the stone door open, just a sliver, and she called out, "How can you be laughing when I have taken the light away?" And she peered out, and there, in the crack of the door, she saw a face of shining glory looking back at her, brighter than anything, and she leaned toward it, curious. It was her own reflection in the mirror. And in that instant, a strong god waiting at the side seized the door and hauled it open, and the sun came flooding back into the world. Light returned. Creation was saved. But there was still the matter of the one who had caused it all. And this time, there would be no sister making excuses. The assembled gods turned as one to Susanoo, and they passed their judgment. And it was heavy. He was made to pay an enormous fine, a mountain of goods to answer for what he had done. And then they marked him, so that everyone would know what he was. They cut off his beard. They pulled out his fingernails and his toenails, and stripped, shamed, disfigured, and utterly cast down. Susanoo was driven out of heaven for good, sent tumbling down toward the world below. This was the lowest point of his existence. The god who wanted his mother, who could not fit in, who broke everything he touched, now had nothing at all. He came down hungry, exhausted and starving and alone, wandering the earth. He stopped at last at the house of a goddess to beg for something to eat. Her name was Ogetsuhime, and she was a goddess of food, and she agreed to feed him. But what she did next would turn Susanoo's stomach so violently that this act of kindness would end in yet another death. And out of that death, of all things, the world was about to be fed. Chapter 6. The Murder That Fed the World. Ogetsuhime wanted to give the starving god a proper feast. So she set about preparing food for him, but the way she made it was the problem. She did not cook it or gather it in any way Susanoo recognized. She drew the food out of her own body. From her mouth and her nose and other places besides, she produced dish after dish and laid it all out before him. A whole banquet conjured from herself. And Susanoo, who had already been humiliated past his breaking point, watched her do this. He did not see a miracle. He saw an insult. He saw filth. He believed she was offering him something defiled, something unclean, and the last thread of his patience snapped. In a flash of that old, ungovernable temper, he drew his blade and he struck her down. The goddess of food lay dead at the hands of the storm. And this is the strangest and most important turn in the whole of Susanoo's story, so stay with me. Because from the body of the slain food goddess, something began to grow. Life came pouring out of her death. From her head came silkworms, the little makers of thread. From her eyes sprang the first rice. From her ears grew millet. From her nose, red beans. From other parts of her, wheat and beans of every kind. A high god of creation gathered up all of it, every seed and every grain and every silkworm, and carried it away to become the food and the cloth of the whole world. This, the old story tells us, is where our crops come from. This is the origin of the very grain in the fields. Farming itself, the thing that feeds every human being who has ever lived, was born out of one of Susanoo's darkest acts. Hold that contradiction in your hands for a second, because it is the heart of everything I have been asking you tonight. The same God, the same terrible temper, and out of it, out of an act of blind violence, comes the rice that feeds a nation. Destruction, in his hands, keeps turning into life. He cannot seem to help either one. Now, I owe you one more of those honest little forks in the road. In one great chronicle, this is Susanoo's deed exactly as I have told it. But in another old book, a nearly identical story is told about a completely different god, the moon god, killing a different food goddess, and the crops grow just the same. Two versions, two killers, one harvest. I lean toward the telling where it is Susanoo, because it fits the shape of his life so perfectly. But I wanted you to know the other exists. And here, at his lowest and his cruelest, the wind finally changes. Because the very next thing this disgraced, exiled, blood-soaked god is going to do is become the most beloved hero in all of Japan. And it starts, quietly, with the sound of an old couple weeping beside a river. Chapter 7. Yamata no Orochi, the eight-headed serpent. Susanoo came down at last into a land called Izumo in the west of the world, and he followed a river upstream toward the sound of crying. And there, on the bank, he found them. An old man and an old woman, and between them a young woman, and all three of them weeping as though their hearts had already broken. Susanoo stopped, and for the first time in his long, furious life, this god who caused so much grief asked someone else about theirs. Their story came out through the tears. The old couple had once had 8 daughters. 8. But every single year, a horror came down out of the hills and took one of them away. And now, after 7 long years of loss, only this one was left, their youngest. Her name was Kushinada Hime, and by some lovely turn, her name carries in it the words for a comb and for a rice field, a small hint of the harvest and the home she was meant to have. And her time had almost come. So Susanoo asked the question that would remake his life. "What is it? What takes your daughters?" And they told him. It was called Yamata no Orochi, the 8-forked serpent. And as they described it, you understand why they had given up hope. This was not a snake. This was a landscape that hated you. The creature had 8 heads and 8 tails, and its body was so vast that it sprawled across 8 valleys and 8 hills at once. On its back grew moss and whole cypress and cedar trees, an entire dark forest riding on a living thing. Its eyes glowed the deep red of winter cherries, of embers about to catch, and its underside was raw and inflamed, worn red from dragging its enormous bulk across the mountains for longer than anyone could remember. That was what was coming for the last daughter. That was what 7 of her sisters had already vanished into. And Susanoo, the outcast, the god heaven itself had spat out, looked at this doom that shadowed 8 valleys, and he made an offer. "Give her to me," he said. "Give me your daughter as my wife, and I will rid you of this thing forever." The old couple, who had nothing left to lose, agreed. And then the storm god began, for the very first time, to think. This is the moment Susanoo changes. Watch him stop raging and start planning. First, he took Kushinada Hime, and to keep her safe, he transformed her, shrinking her down into a small, close-toothed comb, which he tucked into his own hair, right against his head, where nothing could reach her. He carried the girl he was fighting for, hidden in his own hair. Then he turned to the couple. "Brew sake," he told them. "Not ordinary sake. Brew it 8 times over, thick and strong enough to fell a god. Build a fence and set 8 gates in it, and behind each gate place a platform, and on each platform set a great vat, and fill every vat to the brim with that ferocious brew. 8 gates, 8 vats, 1 for each terrible head." And then they waited, in the dark, for the hills to begin to move. And the hills did move. The serpent came, exactly as they feared, 8 heads swaying up out of the valleys under a forest of its own trees, drawn by the smell of the sake. Each of its 8 heads found its own vat. Each head plunged down and began to drink. And Susanoo, hidden and still, watched the monster that had swallowed 7 daughters lower its guard, 1 greedy head at a time. His hand moved to his sword, and as the last head drank deep, the blade came free. Chapter 8. The sword in the serpent's tail. The strong sake did exactly what he had planned. 8 heads had drunk their fill, and 8 heads grew heavy, and the vast serpent that shadowed 8 valleys sank down into a deep and helpless sleep, its guard finally, fatally, down. And Susanoo struck. He fell upon the sleeping monster and cut it apart, length by length, head by head, until the terror that had haunted Izumo for 7 years was ended, and the river ran red down the valley. But something strange happened as he worked his way along the great body. When his blade bit into one of the 8 tails, it did not slice clean through. It struck something hard, and the edge of his own sword chipped against it. Susanoo stopped. He cut the tail carefully open, and inside, buried in the flesh of the monster, he found a sword. And what a sword! A blade of such beauty and power that he knew at once it was no ordinary weapon. This was the sword that would come to be called Kusanagi, the grass cutter, one of the most sacred objects in all of Japan. Think of the poetry of that for a moment. Out of the body of the worst monster in the land, he draws the most precious treasure. Once again, from the very heart of something terrible, Susanoo pulls out something wondrous. It is the pattern of his entire existence, made into a single, shining blade. And then he did something that tells you how much this god had changed. He did not keep the sword to boast of. He sent it up to heaven, to his sister, Amaterasu, the sister whose world he had wrecked, as a gift, as an offering of peace, an apology forged by a monster from a brother who had finally understood what he had done. And that sword passed down and down through the ages until it became one of the 3 great treasures of the imperial line of Japan, said to be guarded to this very day. With the monster dead and the sword sent home, Susanoo lifted the little comb from his hair and returned Kusanagi Hime to herself. And he married her. The exile had a wife. The storm had a home. He went looking through the land of Izumo for the right place to build their palace, and he came to a spot where something in the air felt clean and clear and right, and he said, "Here, my heart is at peace here." And he raised a palace, and around it, clouds gathered in great rolling layers. And standing there, looking at those clouds banking up over his new home with his rescued bride inside it, this god of chaos and grief did the last thing you would ever expect. He spoke a poem. A short, simple, aching little verse about 8 clouds rising over Izumo and the 8-fold fence he was building to keep his wife safely within. And that little poem is remembered as the very first true poem in the history of Japanese literature. The god who broke heaven became the father of Japanese poetry. I don't think you could invent a stranger turn if you tried. So there it is, the happy ending. The monster slain, the bride won, the peace made, the poem sung. Most stories would stop right here and let the credits roll. But Susanoo's story does not stop here. Because there was still one place left for him to go. One kingdom still waiting for its king. and it lay beneath the world, down in the dark, in the land of the dead he had wept for since the day he was born. Chapter 9. Lord of the Land of the Dead. Remember the very first thing Susanoo ever wanted. Not the sea, not a throne in heaven. He wanted to go down to the land of his mother, the shadowed realm beneath the world. And in the end, he got his wish. Susanoo descended, and he became the ruler of that deep place, the land of roots, the dim country under everything, where the dead and the beginnings of things live tangled together. The homeless god finally had a home, and it was the underworld itself. And there the story leaps forward, generations down the line, to a young god who was one of Susanoo's own descendants. His name was Okuninushi, and he was the gentlest soul in a family of cruel elder brothers. Those brothers hated him, and they tried to kill him more than once. And so, hunted and desperate, Okuninushi fled to the only place they would not follow. Down, into Susanoo's kingdom of the dead. And down there, in the land of roots, he met a young woman, and the two of them fell instantly and completely in love. Which would be lovely, except for one detail. She was Suseribime, and she was Susanoo's daughter. So this frightened young god, hiding from his murderous brothers, had just fallen for the daughter of the terrifying old lord of the dead. And Susanoo, when he found out, decided to see what the boy was truly made of. He welcomed Okuninushi in with a smile that promised nothing good, and then he set him a series of trials, each one designed to kill him. On the first night, he sent the young god to sleep in a chamber filled with snakes. Okuninushi would have died there, except that Suseribime slipped him a magic scarf, and when he waved it, the snakes went still and let him rest. The next night, Susanoo sent him into a room crawling with centipedes and stinging wasps. And again, quietly, his daughter passed her love another scarf. And again, the crawling things grew calm around him, and he lived to see morning. So Susanoo raised the stakes. He took the young god out to a wide field, and he shot a single arrow far out into the grass, and he told him, "Go, fetch it." And the moment Okuninushi walked out into the middle of that field, Susanoo set the whole thing on fire, all around him, a ring of flame closing in. Okuninushi stood trapped in the center, with the fire rushing toward him from every side, and no way out. And then, at his feet, a little field mouse appeared, and the mouse whispered a secret. "The ground below is hollow," it said. "Stamp down." So he stamped, and the earth opened, and he dropped into a hidden pocket beneath the field and let the fire roar over his head. And when it had passed, the same little mouse brought him the very arrow he had been sent to find. By now, Susanoo, I think, half admired the boy. He took him back into the great hall, and there, as the old god lay resting and let the young one comb through his hair, Okuninushi made his move. Working in silence, he tied Susanoo's long hair to the rafters of the hall, fastening the sleeping lord of the dead to his own roof. Then he snatched up Susanoo's great sword, his bow, and his singing koto, swept up Suseribime onto his back, and ran. Susanoo woke to find himself literally bound to his own house, and by the time he tore the hall down getting free, the young couple were already fleeing toward the border of the living world. He pursued them all the way to the long slope that divides the dead from the living, and there he stopped. And this is where the whole of his life comes to its point. Because the old god, cheated, robbed, and outwitted by a boy who had stolen his daughter and his treasures, did not curse him. He stood at the edge of his dark kingdom, and he laughed, and he called out a blessing. With that sword and that bow, he shouted, "Go and become the ruler of the land." The god who was thrown out of heaven for causing a death had just handed a kingdom to the thief who beat him. So what, in the end, do we actually call a god like that? Epilogue. The storm they couldn't live without. So let us finally answer the question I asked you at the very beginning. How does the villain become the hero? After everything we have followed tonight, I think the honest answer is that he was never really only one or the other. Susanoo is not a monster who got redeemed, and he is not a hero who happened to have a dark past. He is the storm. And a storm is not good or evil. It simply is. It floods your fields, and it waters your crops with the very same rain. Look back over his life, and you see the same shape again and again. His grief dries up the seas, but that grief is only love with nowhere to go. His violence kills a goddess, and out of her body grows the food that feeds the world. His temper wrecks heaven, and his courage saves a family from a monster. From the worst thing in the land, he pulls the most sacred sword in the land. Destruction and creation in Susanoo were always the same gesture. The ordered world of heaven could not hold him, so it cast him out. And then it spent the rest of eternity depending on the things only he could do. That is why, even now, people still turn to him. He became a guardian, a god you call on for protection against disaster, against sickness, against the very kinds of chaos he himself once embodied. Who better to shield you from the storm than the god who is the storm? There is a deep and very old wisdom in that, in making peace with the wild thing, rather than pretending you can be rid of it. And there is one more secret folded into him, a quieter one, that I have saved for the end. Some scholars believe that Susanoo may not have started out as a Japanese god at all. There are old hints that he came from somewhere else, that behind the storm god of the chronicles stands an outsider, perhaps a god carried over the sea from the mainland, perhaps a deified holy man from a distant kingdom, later woven carefully into the family of the sun and the line of emperors. If that is true, then the god who never fit in, the eternal outsider of these myths, may have been an outsider in the deepest way of all, a stranger, quietly written into the family. I find something moving in that. It is not proven, but it lingers. And he is not alone in the wider world either. Almost every people who ever looked up at a thunderstorm told a version of this same tale. The storm set against the serpent. The Greeks had their sky god against a monster of 100 heads. The Norse had their thunderer against the great world serpent. Far to the west, other gods raised their weapons against other coiling dragons of chaos. Susanoo is Japan's chapter in a story that humanity, it seems, simply cannot stop telling. The storm and the serpent, over and over, in every language there is. But I keep coming back to where he began. A newborn god at the edge of the world, weeping for a mother he had never met, wanting only to go down into the dark and be near her. Everyone called him a troublemaker. His father exiled him, heaven cast him out. And in the very end, after the dragon and the sword and the poem and the trials, where did he finally arrive? Down in the land of the dead. His mother's country. Home, at last. The outcast went home, and from there he gave his blessing to the future and let the living world go on without him. So the next time a storm rolls in over your part of the world, wherever you told me you were listening from tonight, maybe think of him, the grieving, raging, impossible God who wrecked heaven and fed the world with the same 2 hands. If this story moved you, do leave a like. Tell me down in the comments which version of him you believe in, and subscribe so you are here for the next one. Until then, thank you for listening. Yours, Lady Mythos.